so much for being here. This is really exciting. It's our pleasure to welcome Dr. Bill Richards. I'm Pastor Brian. For those who don't know me, I'm pastor here at St. Matthew. And one of the topics that I'm very interested in, which is actually I'm working on my PhD dissertation right now, studying the spiritual and mystical components of psychedelic assisted therapy. And so it's a really fascinating topic: psychedelic spirituality, entheogen, mysticism. And our guest, Bill Richards, he wrote the book on it. So it is my pleasure to welcome him, and let's give him a round of applause.
Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming out and joining me on this incredible frontier of medical treatment, discovery of the human mind, and of religious frontiers. I find myself thinking of Teilhard de Chardin's line that we are all spiritual beings who are having physical experiences right now. It's kind of a nice perspective to tune into. I'm going to talk for probably a little too long, and then we will have time for discussion and question and answer and reflection. So let's look forward to that. Let me put this in perspective. I like to think of the pillars of religion, any religion, whether it's Christianity or Hinduism or Islam or Judaism, you name it. And there's always sacred scriptures. And there are people who devote themselves to deciphering the ancient scriptures in the original language and search for the discovery of truth in the written documents, okay? Then there's theological formulations. Then they change over time, but that's basically a rational activity, relating the traditions to current life in one way or another. But we have our Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed, the Jewish Talmud, the writings of the lectures of Shankara and Ramanuja in Hinduism, and so on. Okay, then we also have our patterns, the way we do things right, okay? Our vestments, our architecture of our worship spaces, our styles of music, how we move through baptism and marriage and funerals, you know, and that's part of any of the world religions. Then there's social activism, you know, getting out in the world and doing something. In India, they call karma yoga, as opposed to bhakti, which is devotion. Karma is getting out there and doing stuff. So we have our hospitals and schools and retirement homes and soup kitchens and our political causes that we believe in. And then there's this area that we don't talk a lot about, especially in seminaries, interestingly enough, and that's primary religious experience. William James talked about primary and secondary. Primary is what happens to you. Secondary is what happened to someone else and they tell you about it and you agree with it or it makes sense to you. But primary is in your own human consciousness, if you will, experiencing the holy. And there's many varieties there, from an intuitive sense of sacredness. John Wesley in Methodism felt his heart strangely warmed one day. Okay. Experiences of conversion, of confession, facing up to guilt and grief, and experiencing a sense of forgiveness, new beginnings. And then some people have these things we call visions, whether it's the Christ or the Virgin Mary or Kuan Yin or the dancing Shiva. And then there's this thing called mystical consciousness, a unitive state of awareness that I'll get into shortly. But anyway, if you could think of where you are in your own life right now, if you were to rate each of those on a 10-point scale, how would that characterize your own experience of being a religious person right now? Some people are almost exclusively oriented on one of them. I would suggest that a healthy religion has respect for all, and we try to have them in some meaningful balance. But clearly tonight, it's number 5. Ready? Okay, how do we access these other states of consciousness? There's all the plethora of meditative procedures, okay? Focus, concentration, diet, fasting, sleep deprivation, different breathing techniques which change the balance of oxygen and carbon dioxide in our systems. Enough carbon dioxide opens up other realms of consciousness. So it seems there's sensory isolation and sensory overload. Either extreme seems to trigger other states of consciousness. Some lucky women encounter it in the middle of natural childbirth. All of a sudden, there's a profound spiritual awareness that opens up. Some really lucky people have an occasional orgasm that's just beyond anything they experienced before, that feels intrinsically sacred, unitive, beautiful. There's artistic creation. People lose their sense of time because they're so busy creating something, and they shift into another consciousness. And then, perhaps as some of you know, sometimes these revelatory experiences, if you will, happen completely without expectation or trying to make them happen. They just happen in the middle of the night. And who knows why or what's going on. And they happen in good agnostics and atheists too, which is kind of delightful. And God does not check your attendance at Sunday school before he gives you a revelatory experience. It simply happens. Okay, so there's all these, and then we have, where we're concentrating tonight, these psychedelic mind manifesting, if you will, molecules. And they can either be natural or synthesized. It seems it's the molecule itself that counts. What makes psychedelics unique is their potency. I mean, we can get together and meditate for a Saturday afternoon, and some might experience something profound, and many would simply have a relaxed, centered afternoon. But psychedelics with the right dose will make something very dramatic occur. Okay, so it's powerful, it's reliable. And when skillfully administered, psychedelics are incredibly safe for most people. They are not addictive, and they're essentially non-toxic. So what do we have here? Psilocybin, that's what comes from the sacred mushrooms, if you will. May be viewed as sacred molecules that provide opportunities to access healing processes and discover new knowledge. The different psychedelics, major psychedelics, are almost like different skeleton keys, if you will, that unlock the same door. And when you unlock that door, there's a variety of states of consciousness waiting to be explored. So there's no such thing as the psychedelic experience. Okay? But the drug, the action of the drug gives the opportunity to really explore consciousness more deeply than usual. And then what emerges, if you meet that with trust, is usually incredibly wisely choreographed for you at that moment in your life. That's why in many of the religious organizations that use psychedelics, they refer to psychedelics as the teachers. Especially in the ayahuasca traditions in South America, when you take the psychedelic, you humbly go inside for a lesson. And it might be a painful or difficult lesson, but it's in the interest of your personal and spiritual development. So you trust whatever the agenda of the teacher may be, okay? Okay, psilocybin mushrooms. Why do we use psilocybin? One reason is it's hard to spell, and it doesn't get the publicity that LSD gets. But just briefly, psilocybin is found on our planet in at least 200 different mushrooms. It's all over the place. It's been successfully synthesized, so what we use in research is not a mushroom, it's born in a test tube, but that molecule is mighty sacred, and we know the purity and the exact dosage when we're working with a synthesized substance. It has a long history of religious use going back to at least 500 BC. It's not new, and it emerges in cultures and it gets suppressed, and it emerges and gets suppressed like mushrooms, okay? And right now in the early 21st century here, they're emerging in our culture. And many of us are hoping that we're smart enough this time to wisely and safely integrate them into the culture so they don't explode and get suppressed yet once again. They're incredibly safe. I'll talk about setting in a minute. Psilocybin lasts just 6 hours. So that's in high dosage. So that it works into the workday pretty well. Back in the earlier days, we worked with LSD, and that's always at least 8 hours and often 14. Makes for a very long day. With all due respect, but people do get tired. Also LSD builds up very gradually. So the most for psychotherapy, between the 3rd and the 5th hour, that the most useful, important time actually occurs. So as you're kind of sitting there waiting for it to build up. Where with psilocybin, an hour in, you're at, it's like, let's get down to business. Let's really go to work. And then psilocybin terminates in a very gentle but firm way. There's a point where, you know, I'm back now, back to normal. Where LSD has this bouncing ball effect, you're back and then you drift off, and you're back and you drift off, you're back and you drift off for a while. Okay. So there may be many substances, many molecules besides psilocybin that will be used in 5, 10, 15 years from now. But our focus right now is on psilocybin, in part to get one drug off Schedule 1, to make it legally accessible. And so the research community is kind of gathering forces around research with psilocybin. If you go to clinicaltrials.gov, the website, and type in psilocybin, you'll find there are, but I think when I last looked, there were about 60 federally approved research projects with psilocybin, many of them with normal, healthy people, as well as different applications in medical treatment. Okay, how many of you have read Hermann Hesse's what is it? Not Journey to the East, not Siddhartha, Steppenwolf.
What is it?
Steppenwolf, anyone?
Yes.
Okay, well, in Steppenwolf, there's the green door that appears in the garden wall, just for you, at just the right time. Okay, it's a visionary door that takes you into your inner world. And if you have the courage to open the door and not just stand there and look, but really venture in, you enter what he called the magic theater, which has as many doors into as many boxes as you please, 10 or 100 or 1,000, and behind each door, this is the essence of psychedelic therapy, exactly what you seek awaits you. Very often in psychedelic therapy, people will say at the end, I didn't experience what I wanted, but I experienced what I needed. There's a wisdom in the psyche about how the content of the healing, discovering, growing process is choreographed. And I think I can tell you that's the most amazing part of it to me. Okay, some psychedelic experiences open immediately into very bright, glorious places. Some open into very dark, scary places. The experiences that we value can be either pleasant or unpleasant. And they basically include personal psychological insights, as I'll say more about in a minute, but also visionary experiences and mystical states. Potentially negative experiences, the so-called bad trips, frankly, don't happen in the research world anymore. They're incredibly rare because you don't give the drug to someone until there's a sense of trust and openness established. The panic, paranoia, despair, confusion come when material arises and you try to run away from it. Like a nightmare, right? What happens if you run away from the monster? It gets bigger, you get smaller, you wake up in a cold sweat and you're scared to go to sleep again. Okay. What's happening? You're running away from something within your mind that might like to teach you something. But you're not ready for the lesson, okay? Then there's just neutral experience, especially with low dosage. And, there are some people who have, dropped acid 200 times and they've giggled and they've gotten a little paranoid and they've seen pretty colors, but they have yet to really experience something of profound meaning or personal relevance, okay? So it's not just how many times you put a psychedelic in the system, but it's how you respond to it and how you're prepared for it and how you go about it that matters. Doesn't want to advance here. Okay. Now, what makes the difference in what happens is setting, and dosage. Set your mental attitudes, your ability to trust, your being in a safe place. It's not just being passive, I'll lie back and see what happens. I'll throw the drug in my mouth and see what happens. Not smart. But it's with this dose of this substance in this context, with the preparation I've had, in the intention I have for personal or spiritual development, et cetera, et cetera. In this situation, I choose to unconditionally trust. So there's a choice that comes out of a strong sense of self. Okay, does that make sense? It's like I'm on the high dive and I don't know what the temperature of the water is down there or how deep it is, but I know others have jumped and they say it's worthwhile. So here I go, but no one's going to push me off the high dive. I choose to go. Courage, it's not to explore, confront, suffer, learn, receive. To go beyond what your head can put into words. Okay, and then the setting, the environment, of course, needs to be safe, confidential, empathic, well-structured. This is our original lab at Johns Hopkins, which you can see is essentially a comfortable living room with a nice stereo system, and some nice art on the wall, and some Tibetan pillows there to focus on. This is a mock-up. My son Brian on the couch, Mary Casamano and myself. We use nice flannel sheets, colored flannel sheets. I grew up in northern Michigan. It makes you feel extra safe and secure. But as you can see, it's there's no white coats in this laboratory. The rows, the sculptures, very safe and protected. This is a new psychedelic therapy room in the Aquilino Cancer Center, where I work in Rockville, Maryland. Just about a mile from FDA headquarters, for whatever that's worth. But that we have 4 psilocybin treatments there, and we're through Sunstone Therapies now. We are hoping to make this a prototype in oncology centers of integrating psilocybin therapy into palliative care. Incredible frontier. Okay, and then let's just acknowledge physiological factors. The dosage of the psychedelic substance does matter. we did a dose response study at Hopkins where we found that the average person needed about 25 milligrams or in order to access these transcendental states of human consciousness. If it was less than that, say 10 to 20 or so, you were likely to experience worthwhile material, but kind of from your personal life, from your growing up, your relation to parents and siblings and your guilt and unresolved grief and all that sort of stuff that makes up ordinary psychotherapy, you know. But it's not likely to open up these profound experiences we usually call religious in one way or another. There's factors we hardly begin to understand, what we call resistance. Some people will have a profound experience with no drug at all. And some people you can give a high dose to and they think they see the air flickering a little bit, okay? So there's a lot that goes into personal ability and readiness to allow these states. There's endogenous DMT, dimethyltryptamine, which is a powerful psychedelic that frankly, in case you don't know, it's in your system right now. That the human organism creates dimethyltryptamine, as do many plants and animals. So by virtue of being human, we're in violation of federal law. And we just can't help it. And authorities say, oh, but it's not very much, you know. But then you think LSD is active in 50 millionths of a gram. You know? You know? So maybe the dose doesn't matter that much. Okay, and you know, there's things we don't know very well yet about presence of other medications and dietary factors, but let's just acknowledge that they're important. Now, what I want to do this evening is take you into these realms that we don't talk about in graduate school in psychology and social work and psychiatry. Yeah, at least we haven't until recently. But they're incredibly important. They go beyond the content of ordinary therapy, which can be facilitated with low doses. It's called psycholytic therapy in Europe, of giving a series of low dose sessions in the psychoanalytic framework. It was to help you move faster through your psychoanalysis, but it's dealing with your relationship with your mother and the like, more than experiencing transcendence. Just a slide I like about the path demons within. Okay. Now, psychedelic mind manifesting therapy that is so incredibly fascinating right now includes these visionary archetypal experiences and what we call mystical consciousness. Believe it or not, mystical consciousness has become a scientific term. You can find it in the Journal of Psychopharmacology now. Okay. Like the word psychedelic, you know, I think it's here to stay. It just means mind manifesting. It has nothing to do with tie-dye t-shirts and whiskey bar. It's a much more profound and broad meaning. What we call archetypal or visionary. Archetypes, as many of you know, are these structures deep within us that Carl Jung felt were part of the collective unconscious. They're simply, you know, where are they? Who knows? You know, are they encoded in our DNA? Do we access them spiritually, whatever that means? But they happen, and with psychedelics, they happen very vividly and very commonly. And people often experience content that seems to come from other religions, other cultures, other periods of history. And they think, where did that come from? You know, what was I doing in ancient Egypt or medieval Europe or wherever? But there it is. So there's a huge frontier within us just to understand what this stuff is. So there's visionary art and landscapes, gods, goddesses, birth experiences. I can illustrate this better in art than I can in words, but if you can imagine this type of imagery being fully alive and multidimensional, almost that you could dive within it and swim through it, okay? That you, as if it was all electrical particles, it could be one little electron dancing pattern. That's sort of what people claim it's like, and they keep these patterns open and open and unfold and unfold. Jeremy Narby suggested we're actually like going down neurons. who knows? But there's these passageways that become very colorful and beautiful and fascinating. There be dragons sometimes, images of Jehovah. This is Alex Grace Christ, the Buddha, Kuan Yin, the Buddhist goddess of compassion, Hindu gods. Precious stones show up a lot. And Aldous Huxley wrote a wonderful essay you may have seen called "Why Are Precious Stones Precious?" And his theory is that we give them to one another in weddings and special occasions, precisely because they remind us of the precious stones in our own minds. And there's something archetypal, eternal about the light that dances with them. The Hinduism talks about the 330 million deities, and each is one facet of one ultimate diamond. If you go deep enough into any facet, you come to the light in the center that unites them all. Very beautiful image. Okay, onward to my favorite topic. Are you ready? Mystical consciousness. I had the good fortune to spend a year with Abraham Maslow, a psychologist at Brandeis, and he actually coined the term peak experiences, like a mountain peak. Maslow himself never took a psychedelic because he had a very acute heart condition. In fact, he died jogging at 62. But he knew what the psychedelics reports were about, frankly, because he was a natural Jewish mystic. And he could lie down in his backyard in the heavens for him sometime. And that's where he discovered peak experiences, the farther reaches of human nature, and so on. It's interesting in the scientific literature, we don't say mystical experiences very often. We say mystical type experiences. Somehow that seems a little more scholarly. Or instead of unitive experiences, we write about non-dual experiences. That's just the insecurity of science, because science is really bumping into what we could call the sacred in this field, and it's awesome. It's the frontiers of science, but we're used to. You know, there was a time where healing included both religion and medicine. They were kind of intrinsically interwoven. And in recent decades in our culture, they've kind of been separated, you know? Medicine is over here and your church is over here, or your religion. Where certainly in the ayahuasca and peyote religions and so on, medicine and religious lives are like much more interwoven and interconnected. And maybe we're moving back into that state again. All these other terms. In philosophy, it's called the numinous, the ground of being, the one. The Buddhist term is the ground luminosity of pure awareness, or the void that contains all reality. The nameless, that's a good term, but it's beyond language. In world religions, each of the great world religions has a word for it. In Christianity, we call it the beatific vision. And that term you hear much more in monasteries than you do on Sunday morning, but it's there within Christianity. Islam, Wafana, Judaism calls it Sekal Muslim, Taoism, Wu Wei, Hinduism calls it Moksha or Samadhi. Buddhism has these terms like Nirvana, celestial Buddha fields, the pure land, Satori. But I would suggest all these terms are pointing towards the same realm of human consciousness. So, in the scientific world, we want to know when that state of consciousness occurs and when it doesn't occur. And trying to do the best science we can, we've come up with this definition of mystical consciousness, which is basically 6 categories. Some would condense it further, but an experience that includes unity, transcendence of time and space, intuitive knowledge, sacredness, deeply felt positive, and ineffability and paradoxicality. And meet my friend Walter Pankey, who developed those categories in his PhD dissertation at Harvard. He was a brilliant man who had his psychiatric residency and a theological degree and a PhD, all from Harvard. And yet he was stupid enough at age 40 to go scuba diving alone. He had never done it before. And he died scuba diving. But he was the best man at my wedding. But he did develop this definition of mystical consciousness that we still use today. So let me take you into it. Category 1, unity, 2 flavors, internal, external. Internal is basically eyes closed, going in as if in dreams, in deeper and deeper through various dimensions of being, or whatever you want to call it, until all of a sudden there's a sense of oneness, unity. External is with open eyes, maybe meditating on a flower or a gemstone or something, and all of a sudden, if any of you know Alfred North Whitehead, the great philosopher, physicist, but he talked about, he called them actual entities, but little pieces of matter, energy, kind of resonating with one another and sensing that they're all part of a great unity, that every consciousness breaks up into these little particles, if you will, that resonate with one another. And the overall insight is that ultimately all is one. There's one ultimate energy consciousness. So I would suggest there are two roads there. Okay, I don't want to bore you too much with descriptions, but let me get over here where I can read this more carefully. This is one description. This is from a cancer patient, a 40-year-old man with several little kids. And this was his experience. He said, I went to a place that seemed to completely lack the qualities of this world as we know. I seemed to transcend time and space, and I lost complete identification with the real world. The experience seemed to me to be as if I was going from this world back to another world before this life had occurred. The actual changing from this life to whatever was before this life seemed to be involved in a very bright silver mass of energy with a strong electrical current. Strangely enough, I felt that I had been in that mass of energy at one time before. When I was there, everything seemed to make sense. It was a very beautiful world, one in which love was very much a part. The basic theme that I perceived was that life continues to go on, and we are basically some form of essence from a supreme being, and we are part of that supreme being. I don't have the fear of death that I once had. I am willing to accept the plan of the Creator and go on when it becomes necessary to the next segment of His creation. I have found that everyday living seems to be much more enjoyable. Small things in life I may have overlooked, I seem to appreciate now. I have a much greater and deeper understanding of other people and a greater capacity to try to fulfill other people's needs. Overall, I think I am a much more content individual, having had the great opportunity to just glimpse for a very short moment the overall thinking of God, of possibly being brought into His confidence for just a brief period, to be reassured that there is a very beautiful, loving, masterful plan in the universe for all of us. But can you imagine that if you were a terminal cancer patient and you had that experience? How, and this is the important point in psychedelic therapy. It's not the effect of the drug. You don't have to take the drug again. It's the memory that's therapeutic. It's a whole new concept in psychiatry, that the memory of an experience can be. Actually, this particular man did live for a decade after this experience. But eventually he did graduate from this life. Okay, here's another example. You know, everyone has their own choice of words, which is great. This was from a alcoholic patient, terribly well educated, but I like the way he writes. The most emotional experience I had during the day was a feeling as though I had died and was drifting into space, moving away from the earth. I started to become very uneasy and nervous, and then the clouds seemed to move aside for me to pass. I was terribly frightened. I felt so alone out there all by myself. Sometimes I seemed to be moving much faster, the clouds parting more swiftly. I wanted very much to go back, but I knew I could not. I began to drift more slowly now and had become more calm. The clouds had gone by from here, so it is very difficult to explain. There was nothing. It was like drifting into empty space. It was so beautifully bright you could see nothing. Then, far off, a small cloud or flower appeared. The beauty and colors were so intense it brought tears to my eyes, but I could not turn away from it. I stretched out my arms to encircle it, but it was growing like a beautiful flower. It became larger and larger until I could no longer control it. Then it burst into such magnificence and beauty as everything seemed to open up. I was laughing at the happiness it gave me. I screamed as I pointed, "It's so beautiful, you can't see it." At that time, I thought I was God, but I couldn't be. This was God, and this must be heaven. I became very confused again. See, the rational mind is starting to think here. If God was here and I was here, then he concludes, I was God. God was me at that time. It seemed all men were here. We must truly all be one. I thought, this is what has been said about eternal life. And one more, this is from a poet. Actually, she's been in some of the psychedelic movies and has identified herself, Judith Gedeke. This was about a dozen years ago when she was struggling with cancer. She's still doing fine, by the way. But this was her report. Early on, the visuals came and dissolved so quickly I could not verbalize them in time. There were countless variations of what reminded me of the ceiling of Westminster Abbey. Gothic, vaulted, great intricacy. These images changed lighting, color, texture. I had no doubt I was in the presence of the infinite because I felt an overriding peacefulness that carried me through everything. Even the very few seconds of yikes that showed up. I had a sense of losing my observer. I no longer witnessed the images, I was becoming them. That's classic. First, you're kind of looking at this display, and then you enter into it, you become it. Okay? This was not exactly creepy, but I did hesitate a minute, feeling my way slowly. There was a sense of being engulfed. Am I about to be possessed? Is this okay? I was unwilling to just hand over my body. I said, if we do this, I want my body returned to me in at least as good a shape as it is in now. The reply came, do you think I would disrespect my own handiwork? I got the point and went with it. My body lit up, all parts in succession. It was the brightest thing I have ever seen. I glowed brilliantly from within. My whole being fluttered. I felt I was being breathed through or played like an instrument. Stunningly beautiful. I got that every part of us is sacred. There is no speck in the cosmos which is apart from this breath. The world is a misery out of love, presenting us with constant opportunity to find our way home. I am seeing myself in everybody and everybody in myself. Okay, I'm not going to take you into external examples. It's just too many words here. Walter Houston Clark, professor of psychology of religion at Andover New Theological School a few decades ago, felt Moses' experience with the burning bush, for example, was an experience of external unity. Who knows? There's Walter. He was a good mentor of mine. Let me take you through this. This is in the auditory realm. The various pieces of music were wonderful, multidimensional. I could hear tiny variations subtle changes in shadings in the voices and instruments, as if I were inside the mind of the composer as he heard it. There was a sense of the composer touching the divine, channeling its perfection down to the human level, so that other people could be aware of it and uplifted too, but simultaneous awareness of the impossibility of the task. As imperfect human beings, imperfect instruments, imperfect voices are involved. Somehow, all of that imperfection was also woven into the perfection the music was channeling. I was inside the music, the composer, the players, the singers, the shaft of the woodwinds, the metal keys of the woodwinds, and the finger pressing keys. People often feel almost as though they're getting into the mind of the composer, or sensing what the composer is trying to say about eternal verities in the language of music. Very profound. Okay, second category, transcendence of time and space. Can't say much about that. My partner Emmett drew this for the cover of my book. Can imagine going through the vortex here. This is Alex Gray's depiction of it. Simply that time and space are categories of perception. It's the way we organize things, but they may not be as ultimately real as we tend to think they are. And I think I'm not a physicist, maybe some of you are, but quantum physics is getting a little closer to being able to talk about this. How matter can behave very differently than we can understand or comprehend, independent of space and time. So this is the realm that in religious language we call eternity, in mathematical language, infinity. But it seems to be within each of us. Okay, that intuitive knowledge that these mystical experiences are not only glorious moments of exaltation, joy, peace, love, emotion, but that they also include knowledge. And that's a radical concept because we're not used to taking intuitive knowledge seriously. We tend to think, well, that's a woman's hunch, or whatever. But, in the great religions, the revelation comes not through rational intellectual process, but through immediate beholding of truth. So it's legitimate that we have, well, okay, what do you know? William James calls it the noetic quality and the varieties of religious experience back in 1902. And really knowing something. What do people know? Typically, the reality of God, or if you don't like the word, some people hate the word God because when they hear it, they think of sitting on uncomfortable pews during long, boring sermons.
There aren't long, boring sermons here. They're all exciting. Short, short, yeah.
So, some people don't want to use the word God, but they'll talk about transcendence or the grounds of being. Or Edmund Sinnott at Yale used to talk about the purpose and properties of protoplasm. But you find a term that works for you. God's okay as far as I'm concerned. But whatever that we call it, it's really real. The sacred dimension is there waiting to be discovered, and it's not going away. The relativity of time. When people have these mystical experiences, they invariably claim to be convinced that consciousness is indestructible. Now, we could say, well, maybe that's a big delusion, you know? But it's mighty convincing when you're there. It just seems obvious. It's like, is the water wet? Of course it's wet. Well, is consciousness indestructible? Well, of course it is. You know, it's just that obvious when you're in that state. So again, for someone approaching the end of life, you can sense how this can really help get rid of anxiety and depression, open up interpersonal communication, and how people can live until they die instead of retreating to a bedroom because I don't want anyone to see me this way, you know. Very important intuitive insight for the ethics, especially, is the sense that of the brotherhood of man, the unity of humankind, that within consciousness somehow we're all interconnected. We're part of one, whatever thing. I don't know what they call it. The Hindus call it the net of Indra, the bejeweled net of Indra, in which we all are interconnected and participate. Very beautiful concept. But are you going to go kill your brother? You know, this has rather profound ethical connection. If we really are all relatives, whether we like it or not, maybe we ought to look at them. Absoluteness of beauty. That beauty isn't just a judgment, but that there's an absoluteness of just beholding how beautiful things are. The primacy of love, that these, hard to put into words, Dante at the end of the Divine Comedy says it is love that moves the sun and other stars. It's a final line of Dante's work. But the feeling is that love is not just a mushy human emotion, but it's an intelligent energy at the very source of creation. That God, when we say God is love, we're saying something really powerful and strong. And for example, I don't want to get too theoretical on you here, but the existentialist psychiatrist philosopher Carl Jaspers, if you will, says, you know, if you go deep enough into your suffering and into your pain, you will be met by what he calls the unbedingte Forderung, or the ultimate impetus of this force called love that heals. Okay, so if you want, that's the essence of psychedelic therapy, really. You go into whatever emerges, even if it's painful, and you keep going deeper and deeper, trusting, and then the healing process comes to you. And that the essence of that is often described as love. The wisdom of the entelechy is one of those philosophical words, but it means the meaningful unfolding of content from within the mind. There's a wisdom within each of us. And then there's just the intensity of the intuitive validation of this. Jeremy and Arby says, once you've seen, you can't unsee. That this state of consciousness, no matter how it happens, feels more real, more fundamental than the state of consciousness we're in right now. And so it's a little bit like, how do you know you love your spouse? You you just do, and you build your life on it. And it's that quality of certainty. How do you know that there's a God. Well, I'm not going to argue with you about it, but I've experienced something within me that is so convincing that for this lifetime I'm content taking it seriously. Sacredness. Good old Gothic cathedrals. Gothic architecture comes up very frequently in psychedelic sessions. And one theory is that in the medieval years, the Gothic cathedral was an attempt to build the visionary world in this reality. And maybe it has something to do with the structures of cells or who knows what. But it's intrinsically, in fact, I think most people, even if they've never gone to church, if they go into a nave of a high Gothic cathedral, they'll feel a sense of reverence. That there's something just intuitive that clicks in there. And that may be because we have Gothic cathedrals within our heads, if you like it or not. And watch, I don't know why this is, then I could have taken it up, but in Washington Cathedral, once a year, usually in the fall, they remove all the chairs in the nave, and they let people come in and lie on their back, and they have changing colored lights projected all over while soft meditative music plays. It's really quite wonderful. But that's trying to recapture the type of thing that often happens in psychedelics. To Saint-Chapelle in Paris, often moving through Gothic spaces. This is a Hungary synagogue in Hungary. This is the Blue Mosque in Isfahan, Iran. I mean, that comes straight out of someone's psilocybin session. I'd be willing to bet that architect it was a spontaneous mystic, a psychedelic. But that's the type of imagery. Even the symbols, the language, those curving lines are very much like what is often experienced during the action of psychedelics. This is a mandala of Shiva from Bali. Typical rose window, a mosque, the great dome of a mosque. Could that be the end of a neuron? Or the fovea of the eye or something? Or just a spiritual structure? But why is it sacred? Why do we build mosques and like there was one at St. Peter's here, but that seems to have gotten lost. But the dome of St. Peter, similarly in Rome, this huge dome, and then at the very top there's a light-filled tunnel that you can go even deeper on. Okay, like a model of something that we consider sacred. Deeply felt positive mood, yeah, and joy, love, peace, blessedness, yeah, unconditional acceptance. I'd like to emphasize cosmic playfulness. Especially in the Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, we tend to lose that. We kind of take our religion so seriously. And Hinduism does help us recapture, especially the idea of the God who plays, who dances, who builds worlds and destroys them and builds new worlds like a kid playing with blocks. It's not such a big deal. Don't worry. It's all eternal. It's all going to be okay. Okay. And then the final category, ineffability and paradoxicality. Meet my friend Gorg here. Gorg is the caveman who's transported to Manhattan today. and he sees skyscrapers and subways and cell phones and you name it. And then he zapped back to his cave, and his wife says, "Well, Gord, what did you experience?" And all he can say is, "It was big, it was loud, it was impressive." But he doesn't have the vocabulary yet for skyscraper and cell phone, etc. Subway, you know. And mystical consciousness is often like that the content feels wisely or choreographed, ordered, meaningful, but it is so beyond everyday consciousness that people feel they just don't have the words to talk about it. And that's why the Russian poet Tuchev says, when it comes to mystical consciousness, a word that's spoken is a lie. Or in the scriptures of Taoism, Tao Te Ching, there's this wonderful verse of scripture: those who know do not speak. Those who speak do not know. Makes it hard to publish articles. So that's part of why people always say, at Hopkins, you know, we probably treated 1,000 volunteers by now, and everyone writes up a report of their experience. But I really bet almost every report has a paragraph of, I'm doing this because I said I'd do it, but this is a ridiculous assignment. There's no way I can adequately put this into words, you know. But here goes. You want some words? Here's some words. But don't think it really fully captures what I experienced, because it's beyond language. And part of that is the paradoxicality. Big word, academic. But it's always both and instead of either or. Angels and demons, male and female, the one and the many, all the opposites are antinomies of philosophy. Yeah, and they're all, it's always both and like that. I love this is Mangala Veshu. But I've got actually printed that in my office. But you know, the angels are so pious and simplistic and sweet, you know, and the devils are so devilish. You know? But somehow together they make up totality. Okay, and it's that principle in this mystical consciousness. But it makes it very hard to put it in words, you know. And it can just sound like I experienced the one that contained all reality. That sounds kind of crazy, doesn't it? You know, it was everything and it was nothing. The void contained all reality. You know, so what are people? You know, it's beyond the limits of usual language. Okay, here's your final exam. Are you ready? Define mystical consciousness. Unity, transcendence of time and space, intuitive knowledge, sacredness, secret thought, positive truth, and ineffability. That's what we're talking about. All of that at the same time. Okay? Maybe in different degrees of intensity and completeness, but this is the landscape of mystical consciousness. Okay, how shall we understand it? Well, clearly this is not just another drug-induced high. This is not the typical marijuana high. So there are rare times where people with marijuana will tap into something of this profundity, but it's rare. Is it cognitive impairment? Well, there's different kinds of knowing, different kinds of cognition. Is it a schizoid flight from reality? What kind of reality? There aren't many true Freudians anymore, but there was a time where they would say, oh, it's just regression to the womb. It's infantile functioning. Well, if we want to follow that model of thinking, there's more going on in that womb than Freud ever thought. I remember when Walter Pahnke had his first psychedelic session in Germany, when he finally heard from Harvard that his doctoral dissertation had been approved and the degree was granted. He didn't dare take a psychedelic before then. First year at Harvard and give him the degree. But once he did, he was having this incredibly profound experience. And a nurse came into the room and looked at him and went out and said, Dr. Pahnke's in the oral stage. That was the framework that they understood at that time. It was just some activity in a part of our brain. The whole mystery of the correlation between our brains and consciousness is immense. We're just beginning to get into that realm. Revelation, that's a religious word. And that's really worth thinking about, because revelation isn't just something that happened at times in the past and got written about in sacred scriptures. The revelation is happening right now in the minds of all kinds of different. That's pretty profound. And that's enough to bring this frontier into theological schools. It's way overdue. Discovery of a spiritual core in consciousness. Okay, what good are these experiences? They certainly do not guarantee sainthood. In medieval mysticism, the first mystical experience was always called the awakening. It's the beginning of the spiritual life. It's not the certification of sainthood, okay? Those insights have to be applied, integrated, and we gradually become more compassionate. My beloved friend Houston Smith, who really articulated the difference between having religious experience and living religious lives. You gotta integrate them. Houston died at 97, about 4 or 5 years ago. Wonderful mentor of mine, though I never actually studied with him. But he wrote the book many of you may know of, Liberal Religions, or in the earlier editions, The Religions of Man. And Houston could get inside of each of the great world religions and write appreciatively, like as if I had grown up with this system of symbols and meaning. This is how I would see the world. And a remarkable man. Went to his Presbyterian, or was a Methodist church most Sundays, and he still prayed to Mecca several times a day. And I introduced the Dalai Lama to the student world. I mean, amazing man. Okay, in the wake of mystical consciousness, there's usually a sense of awe, gratitude. Buddhists talk about that we're having one precious human life. Don't take it for granted. You know, it's a miracle that we're here and we're going to be here 100 years or less. You know, make the most of it. You know, so there's I think of the German philosopher Schelling. He says, why is there something and not nothing? The very fact that we are is incredible, and we don't take life for granted so much. Change in self-concept. When this quality of experience has happened to you, and you vividly remember it, your whole idea of who you are, who other people are, what the nature of reality shifts. Okay? And with that is a change in self-worth. You imagine if, suppose you were an addict and you've lost jobs, your marriage has collapsed, you know, your physical health is in poor shape, you know, and you have this type of experience. And you sense how it changes your whole view of what's possible, who you are, and what resources there are within you that you never knew were there. Really incredibly powerful. You can't view yourself as worthless anymore, no better. You know that there's incredible value within you. This interconnectedness, you can't pretend to be alone and isolated anymore, because you glimpse how you are meaningfully into to the world as a whole. Full change in your understanding of who you are, sense of rebirth, empowerment. Of course, I can get control over my addiction. You know, I've got all these inner resources. You know, I know how to go and get help. And there's no guilt that can't be forgiven. There's a strong sense of new life, no matter what has happened. You're forgiven, you can forgive others, get on with life. People get much more attuned to ecology and nature. No one's done it yet, but I'd be willing to bet that people who have had these experiences kill less bugs. Yeah, that they're kind of amazing little creatures. You want to help them outside. You're not going to just smush them. But there's a reverence for life, as Albert Schweitzer described, that comes out of this. And of course, one of the most profound things is the loss of the fear of death. And let me just say a few words about that. I want to wind up pretty fast here, so we have time together. Cancer patients and others, for that matter, who have mystical experience often claim to have lost the fear of death. They approach death instead of with fear, kind of with curiosity almost. Like, gee, you know, everyone who's ever been born has eventually died. So there's a pretty good chance that I'm going to die someday, you know. But there's kind of an intrigue. I wonder what it'll be like. I'm curious, you know. But at the same time, these people don't get suicidal. Like there's no urge to speed up their death. Conversely, it's like the opportunity to live another day opens up with all its possibilities, and you want to live as fully as you can for as long as you can. But you can conceive of the last day of your life, holding the hand of someone you love and listening to your favorite music, and maybe even having your favorite food for breakfast if you're able to, you know, that you can live until you die instead of wise. And that's why it's so promising in hospice and palliative care frontiers right now to make this experience available to people who are in close proximity to death. Okay, applications in medicine, the big ones are palliative care, addiction, treatment of depression, post-traumatic stress. But these aren't just tools in medicine. They're also tools in education. What if we started having optional weekend retreats for theological students, where they could legally receive a psychedelic under maximally safe conditions? Would not be a required course, but why shouldn't you get academic credit for it? This is experiential learning. Instead of just reading about the great saints and mystics, you could experience what they experienced. Training of mental health providers to be aware of these resources within their psyche. And, you know, philosophers, musicians, biologists, physicists, whatever. Who knows what they would do with these insights? And then, of course, in religion, the seminary and retreat centers of the future. Let me just introduce you, in case you don't know them, to a few of my friends and colleagues. Even though most of them are dead. Wayne Teasdale, if you want a really good introduction to meditation, I think one of the best books out there is his Mystic Heart. Wayne was both a Christian and a Buddhist monk. I have never known someone who loved to meditate as much as Wayne. When he was with me one weekend, we had 20 minutes for lunch. He said, "We've got 20 minutes, let's meditate." It was like eating chocolate. He just loved it. Teilhard de Chardin, you know, who's a wonderful example of a scientist who was also a deeply spiritual. If you read his books, The Phenomenon of Man, The Future of Man, it's the scientist speaking. If you read The Divine Milieu, Hymn of the Universe, it's the poet within. And they're both coming from the same man. His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who's also quite an amateur scientist, reminds us that the view that all mental processes are necessarily physical processes is a metaphysical assumption, not a scientific fact. And that comes from this little book of his called The Universe in a Single Atom. It's really an incredibly profound construct that mystics often write about, that the astronomical world and subatomic world, they ultimately can somehow be the same. Well, Paul Tillich, theologian, who talked of God as being the ground of being, very much like the Hindu Atman Brahman. You know, in Hinduism, they speak about the drop of water of the individual self, the Atman, merging with the ocean of Brahman. And Tillich's the ground of being is very much like encountering God in this very vast universal way. That doesn't mean you can't also have visions of Christ or the Virgin Mary or whatever. There are many different types of religious experience, but when I was in theological school, we were taught there was Eastern mysticism with the Atman Brahman unity, and Western mysticism with Saint Teresa of Avila and Meister Eckhart. And now we know that there's very good evidence that the same human being, whether born in the West or East, can experience both states of consciousness. That's a part of our human repertoire. Tillich talked about the many paths up the mountain to what he called the really real God. It's kind of a nice term. And when he died, he was working in a systematic theology religion. In Judaism, Reb Zalman was a very strong supporter of psychedelics. David Steindl-Rast, still alive in his 90s. If you want to be inspired, so you can just go to gratefulness.org. Brother David feels that the essence of the religious life is gratitude. And if you can feel gratitude, you got it made. Anya Palmer's his good Zen Buddhist friend. I like the ox herding metaphors. This comes from Zen Buddhism, but it's a perfect metaphor for stages in the spiritual journey, if you will. And it goes like this. It begins with searching for the ox, searching for meaning, you know, finding the first footprints, first sighting the ox, approaching it, dialoguing with it, struggling with it. And then the day comes where you tame the ox and you ride upon it. And then, if you're very lucky, the day comes where you become the ox. And then there may be a unitive state where there's no ox and there's no you. You're part of all that is and ever has been. But then the final stage of the spiritual journey is riding the ox back home to chop wood and carry water in the market. Be a compassionate person in a very simple, genuine way in the everyday world. I just like that as a metaphor. Our human quest in life. Okay, where are we right now in the psychedelic world? We're going to continue to design and implement good research projects. We're going to keep respectfully communicating with colleagues in the FDA and the European Medicine Association and the culture at large. Trying not to frighten the horses, but to speak in languages people can comprehend. If data support it, and hopefully this will happen two to 4 years from now, psilocybin will come off of Schedule 1 and become prescribable for trained providers. We're putting a lot of energy into training facilitators, teaching psychologists and social workers and chaplains, and you name it, how to responsibly and safely use psychedelic substances. And a lot of effort is going on in dialogue with insurance companies to pave the way for Medicare and other insurance companies covering psychedelic treatment. So this doesn't become something that only the super wealthy can afford, but that it's accessible to anyone who is suffering and in need of it. The future is now. This is the Wellness Center of the Aquilino Cancer Center, which opened about a year ago, designed for psilocybin therapy. And if you see the woman in the red dress there behind her are 4 rooms for psilocybin therapy. And it's real. And very thankful to be associated with it. My friend Bob Jesse reminds us that it's not only therapy for people who are critically ill, but it could be used wisely for what he calls the betterment of well people. Good old Rick Doblin, who founded MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, has been focusing on methamphetamine, MDMA, somewhat different but related in some ways to psilocybin. He foresees the day of the future where there will be psychedelic therapy centers, retreats, where you can go and consult and be medically screened if you need it, have good preparation, have strong guidance with the right dose of the right substance, and opportunities for implementing and integrating. There's my book, and that's enough for now. So,
Great.
comments, questions, you name it. Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much for the overview, Phil. Fascinating. I'm very interested. You're an advisor, I think, on Pastor Brian's thesis.
I'm honored to be, yes.
I'd be interested in a little bit of overview of the thesis and maybe your input, Phil, on the Pastor Brian's thesis, just a little bit of interaction.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. You wanna say
Yeah.
a few words?
Sure, sure. So, yeah, as Steve said, my PhD thesis dissertation is on spiritually significant psychedelic experiences. And so essentially what I did for my research was to interview people who had spiritually significant psychedelic experiences and were clinical mental health professionals. And so for my research, it was about a year ago, I did 17 different interviews. And I basically categorized all of the, let's see, I spent a lot of time categorizing all of the interviews and the experiences, and there were 8 main constructs that I came up with. And I'm planning on, when I do my final defense, I can share all of that research with you all here. But some of the really fascinating stuff that came up was a lot of these experiences. I remember, if you remember the quotes that Bill shared about different patients who were undergoing psychedelic assisted treatment. So many of those are that love is the core of the universe, and all of these, really amazing, profound statements that changed their lives were one of the, the main things that I came across in my interviews too. So, yeah, it's, and I'm not totally done yet with the dissertation, but when it is done, then I'll be happy to share it with everyone. So yeah.
We can all celebrate it.
Right.
What input has Bill had for you, Mr. Brian?
What's that?
What input has Bill given you?
Well, nobody's read the whole thing yet. I don't think you
I'm
yeah,
waiting.
I have to. So right now I have my chair methodologist, external reader, and this month I'm going to be finishing that and getting it to everyone, and then they all read it, and then I make edits, and then final defense and all that. So the whole thing is sort of being compiled right now. But yeah, so that's kind of as far as my stuff goes. Steve.
Hey, Brian, so thank you, William, for your presentation. I wondered if maybe in your conversations as Christians, we see not only the core of the universe is love, laughter at the core of the universe, like you said, in Him we live and breathe and have. To what extent do we also see experiences and understanding of Christ and the Holy Spirit and understanding sacrifice?
Great frontier for theologians. Yeah.
Right.
What do we mean by a Holy Spirit, for example? Some people would say, well, that is the experiential sense of the reality of the divine in our lives. It is not just a cognitive concept. So yeah, we're learning, if you want to talk religious language, we're studying how the Holy Spirit may manifest itself.
Right.
People do have visions of the Christ. There's a classic book, Martin Kahler, theologian in Germany, who distinguishes between the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. And this is one theological avenue to explore. But the Christ of faith is the eternal archetype of love and redemption. It always has been and was before the historical Jesus was born, and is discovered even today by Christians and non-Christians, simply in the psyche discovered. A manifestation of love. That's one theological reflection. Now, there can be many, many others. What's amazing is that good Christians sometimes experience the dancing Shiva without ever having studied Hinduism. And I suspect if we did, this is a hypothesis, someone's great dissertation coming up, if we did a sample of people in India who had never had grown up Hindu, I wonder how many of them might encounter a vision of Christ. But the overall model is that these great structures are simply in our genes. It's given. It's waiting to be discovered. And we're part of something incredibly sacred that's bigger than whatever religious system we happen to grow up in. So the different world religions become almost like different languages for talking about the sacred. And it's good to know your language well and to observe it in all its many forms. But that doesn't mean the others are all going to hell.
And one thing that you said that in Lutheranism, we emphasize the theology of the cross. You all remember many of sermons, right? And when Phil was talking about how entering into that suffering and then finding that at the core of that, having that courage and strength and grace to go into that, the core of that suffering, and finding that love and healing is there. And isn't that the whole message of the cross, that in the world's worst torture device, we find the greatest expression of divine love? And that is, to me, one of the, hearts of Christianity.
Crucifixion leads to resurrection. But it hurts.
Right.
But there's meaning in suffering, potential suffering.
So some of the experiences, Bill, you showed us your experiences, and some of them said LSD. So is LSD now being used along with this other medication?
LSD is not being used a lot right now for several reasons. One is that its duration of action is long. There's so many, when people hear LSD, they go crazy in one extreme or the other. It's come to have a kind of emotional punch that isn't helpful. Frankly, I've personally given both LSD and psilocybin to many people, as well as dipropyltryptamine, DPT, as you may have seen there. And they give access, from my perspective, basically the same strata of experiences. Like they open the door to the same inner world. So it's not like if you want to see elves, you got to take this dose of psilocybin. It's all different ways of accessing the mind.
So
But psilocybin is most likely to come off of Schedule 1 and become legally accessible in the near future.
But the other thing you mentioned, you mentioned that some of the experiences are negative, not very many, but some are tend to turn out negative. Most are positive, but some cannot be so good.
Well, there are often experiences of suffering that are really not, for example, if you've got a lot of repressed grief locked up inside of you, you know, you lost someone special 20 years ago and you were brave and you locked it up, but you've been suffering from depression off and on for 20 years and you've got tense muscles all the time, okay? And during the action of a psychedelic, you tap into that unresolved grief. And you may cry, wail as you were unable to do at that time in your life 20 years earlier. Now, is that a bad trip? Or is that incredibly effective psychotherapy? So sometimes that's why we hear this, I didn't experience what I wanted, but I experienced what I needed. You know, I think of a Roman Catholic priest I worked with who desperately wanted to see the beatific vision. And while he was listening to Bach B minor mass under LSD, he experienced being sexually molested as a child. Like in the wisdom of his mind, that's where he had to go first. That was the work waiting to be done. Okay, is that a bad trip? No, that's really wise, effective psychotherapy. Thank you.
I know I sit next to him. I have questions. Did anyone else in here keep seeing the pandemic? With all the things, I think it brought clarity to it. It made you see things different. Just the pandemic, as negative as the pandemic as it is, there are some things that have been changed.
We're different than we were before. So, yes, sir.
Seems to be, and just like your comments on this, seems to be a lot of things you talk about through these psychedelic experiences is also things that people have talked about after near-death experience.
Yes.
Seems to be a lot of commonality in that.
There's a lot of common themes in the near-death literature and the psychedelic. Often going through tunnels towards light, encountering angels and demons and lost relatives and so on. Many would suggest it's the same inner terrain. Yes, sir.
So is the set and setting part of the sacredness of it? It seems to me psilocybin has been used forever in many different indigenous cultures, very sacred thing. And if we don't keep that sacredness, it becomes, hey, it's just like going to the doctor, pay your money, it's treatment. It's not sacred, something's going to cost. So is that what the
Very
set-
different that the I don't want to be sometimes people take a psychedelic all by themselves and are lucky enough to have a very good experience. I don't recommend it. But generally, to maximize safety and efficacy, a person should receive the psychedelic in the context of some respectful, trusting relationship. You know, a therapist or someone like a therapist. In Oregon right now, they're called them facilitators. But someone who's trained, who isn't going to evaluate, try to influence what happens, but will just be with you in the sacredness of what Uber would call the I love relationship. Relationships, being together in the world is sacred stuff. It's not just giving a medication, see what happens.
we have some questions on Zoom too.
All right.
So,
Any idea how many people are out there?
4, you know,
Okay. They're all welcome.
yeah. So we have, one question is about, we have a friend who has moved to Mexico and is an assistant to a group that exposes military vets to psilocybin. Group experiences led by a Mexican shaman and community building exercises. And they claim some dramatic successes in healing trauma for vets. There are apparently multiple groups to do this in Mexico. I have no knowledge of long-term outcomes or studies of this approach. Question is, do you know of these group type techniques and any thoughts or appraisal of the approach? So vets and group psilocybin sessions.
Two big thoughts. I mean, we're just beginning to really explore group preparation and group integration. And there's a wonderful therapeutic dimension, if you will, of being part of a group as opposed to individual treatment. But the other big driving factor is that it's less expensive. Much of the research thus far has happened, as you saw, in one of these nice living rooms with 2 professional therapists. And that's ridiculously expensive. It's kind of like going to the concert in a Lamborghini instead of a Ford. They'll both get you there. And so if we want this to come into the mainstream and be accessible, we really want to explore ways of having one therapist in the room instead of 2, with another person on the back on call if needed, you know, to do some of the preparation, psychoeducation, how to learn how to navigate this inner world that we talk about before we give psilocybin. Which basically boils down to, if you see something scary, go towards it, don't run from it, and don't try to explain what's going on when it's happening, just collect experiences. Okay? So there's that psychoeducation and there's the building of trust that's done before, but some of that can be done in a combination of individual and group work and be less expensive, so it's more inviting for insurance companies to cover it. And similarly, after the session, integration can be both individual and group. In our work with cancer patients, we have a group now that meets once a month of people who have been through the research project. And it's amazing what a community they form and how they support each other. And that's a whole dimension that was missed in the exclusively individual. So who knows? Keep doing it.
Right. Any other questions in the room? I have one more from Zoom.
Okay, one more from Zoom here.
All right. I'm curious, when and if it becomes legal, how exactly could it be used for spiritual exploration versus as opposed to depression, anxiety, and mental health treatment? So how psychedelics
Have a good retreat center in the woods, not far from here, where if for people who desire it, it's never required. But say, "Dear, I'd like to do a retreat that includes the experience of a psychedelic," and you could sign up for it. You could be medically screened to be sure that you don't have an acute heart condition or something that would make it unwise. Good preparation in a very supportive setting. either an individual or a group session, depending in the ayahuasca and peyote frameworks they're on. The drug itself is given in a group setting, which is often very, very meaningful. And then an integrative period afterwards. Why should that not be a part, an option that people would legally be able to exercise? You shouldn't have to go to Amsterdam or South America to legally receive a psychedelic. You know, makes it much too expensive. It's,
Just to kind of build off that question, you mentioned, I believe it was a priest who went with an expectation of one thing,
right.
but experienced something very different. So I guess it would be nice for you to say, I want a deeper spiritual understanding,
Right.
but that's not necessarily what's
Well,
the experience, you know what I mean?
to take the example of the priest,
Yeah.
that was his road to getting a deep spiritual understanding. Okay, I've got to come to terms with this, my confused sexuality, my inner fears. You know, I've got to make my peace with that in order to be able to trust more completely and feel safe in the world and allow the transcendental experience to occur. So it's all part of the journey, but it's an unexpected part of the journey.
There's already some use in religion, and it's legal. I met somebody at an ayahuasca retreat, an expert. During a mushroom ceremony, he was told by the pharaohs to write a book, wrote a book for 3 days about the law of music in a church. So there's always already that
Right.
legalization.
Yeah, there are more and more ayahuasca groups, you know, doing the legal maneuvers they need to do to not be declared illegal. You know? But it's the exception rather than.
Right, but yeah, there are several ayahuasca churches and that use ayahuasca, and then Native American churches that use peyote, legally protected, and there's been Supreme Court cases that have verified their right to use psychedelics or entheogens in a religious context. Any other questions for Bill? We're right at
Well,
9
thank you
o'clock,
all.
so thank you. Yeah. Bye to our Zoom participants. All right, let's see. Stop recording. All right, and